Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our Luncheon keynote speaker, Terry Ray. Mr. Ray is the Chief Product Strategist with Imperva. In speaking with Mr. Ray earlier, I've learned that he is also the father of 11-and-a-half-month-old twins. So I guess in the family life, that also, or I'm told, that also makes him the Chief Diaper Changer. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Terry Ray. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. So I'm happy to be here. I don't get out of Sacramento very often, but just to give you kind of a bit about who I am. So again, Terry Ray, I am the Chief Product Strategist for Imperva. What that really means is I simply talk to a lot of customers around the globe. I spend a lot of time as an executive sponsor at our customers' locations and talk about what their needs are, what their requirements are, whether it's regulation or some level of theft or data exfiltration. So today what I want to do is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the requirements, some of the concerns that we've identified with our customers, as well as go through a bit of some of the statistics that you'll find in the industry, specifically around data threats. And I've seen a couple of presentations here this past couple of days, and a lot of them have talked and focused about data. How do you protect your data? Why am I an expert at this? I've been in Imperva for almost 12 years now. Imperva's whole business is data security. It's all I've done for 12 years. So I've got a lot of experience with data security. I've seen a lot of problems with data security, and I continue to see some trends, and we'll talk a bit about those trends. So let's get started. This is small. It's small on purpose. You're not supposed to be able to read it. This is Information is Beautiful. So if you've never been to the website, Information is Beautiful, I do encourage you to go. They track public breaches. They track a lot of information, but they do track public breaches. What's interesting is if you look at the bottom of that chart, you work your way to the top. The bottom of the chart is around 2006, 2004, and the amount of data that was stolen. And as you work your way up to 2013, 2014, you can see where the threats really exist. The threats are trying to steal your data. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. The reality is these are all really successful events, really successful attacks. The attackers are being very, very successful, I guess, use the word one more time, at doing what they want to do, which is taking your data. And it's not necessarily all that difficult. We've got a lot of different ways we know of how doing it. We have a lot of organizations that also know how to do it with the white hat penetration test. But the reality is we really don't do yet a good job of shifting what it is that we do from a security perspective to be able to cover these threats. And I realize it's a cat and mouse game. So it's a difficult task that we all are tasked with. So that's what we want to talk a little bit about. And I'm going to make this slide a little bit smaller here. Sorry, a little bigger. And you can dig into it. So some of these you'll recognize, some of them you may not. You know, it's the biggest one there simply says massive American business hack. It doesn't even tell you the organization. So it's a bit general in some cases. And this really speaks back again to the public knowledge that we have. In America, we have a pretty good regulatory, practice of having to do breach notification. When you have data loss, you have to tell somebody about it. We all realize that doesn't always happen. We know that there's not always a requirement for that, so we know that this isn't every attack, this isn't every piece of data. And the reality is a lot of times we never know that we were attacked, and I'll show you a slide on that in a minute. You know, this one, some of you may have seen a previous presentation from one of the people at Imperva. Also, you may have read the Verizon breach reports. It's in there as well. The one I'd like to look at here is that big orange bar at the top, on the top left. And if you see the little short bar next to it, the little 6%. What's interesting about these two bars is that the 6% one says this is the number of incidents. Only 6% of the actual theft incidents, attack incidents, were based on your web applications. But what's interesting is when you actually had a breach, when data was actually exfiltrated, it was exfiltrated 35% of the time came from just these little 6%. Point is while the web applications are certainly a front end to everything that you do, and people try to attack, or attackers try to attack a lot of different things, the thing that they attack the most successfully is your web applications. They get data out of that web application the majority of the time compared to all the other ways. Cyber espionage is getting better, but that's a bit of a general broad term. It can also include web and malware and other kinds of fun things as well. So we kind of lump it together. Now, this is the slide I was going to talk about, right? So how do you know your data is actually been taken? How do you know someone has taken your data? Well, there's a lot of different ways. I'm not going to read them to you here individually, but customers, botnet assimilation, the governments can tell you about it. FBI, FTC, I've seen this a number of times where the government simply said, look, we recognize that your data, based on whatever type of piece of information it is from that data, has been leaked. But what's interesting is, when you see the blue at the bottom, the most encouraging part is that we're getting better at detecting it ourselves. And I'm saying this with a little bit of a wink. 9% were initially reported and detected by the organizations themselves. Only 9% of the time does an organization identify it's been the person or the victim of a data theft. It doesn't happen very often. Most of the time you're told by someone else. A customer saying, hey, I've got a $15,000 charge on my credit card and I only use it one place, it was at your organization. Or I've got my private data and that private data only exists in your organization because you asked for it. So what are you doing to secure it? It just doesn't happen that often. You're told from someone else most commonly. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, when we think about data security, think about the number of different places where it could reside. And I like to lump them into two places: end users and businesses and government servers. Right, so it doesn't matter what kind of server it is, you have data that exists on your endpoints, you have data that exists on your servers. Typically, the data that exists on your endpoints is data that was taken off of the server and put on an endpoint for some reason or another. So the reality is that data really primarily exists in your servers. What I'm going to talk about today is data security at its source, data security at the server, whether that's a database, a file server, a SharePoint server, doesn't matter, but where that data actually exists. And as you notice, when data actually gets stolen, it's uncommon, it's uncommon, but not. It doesn't ever happen. It's in terms of data being stolen off the laptop. Usually, data that does get stolen off the laptop is something that shouldn't have been on the laptop in the first place, but that's not where you're usually going to get millions upon millions of records stolen, though, to be fair, that does happen on occasion. Usually when you're talking about millions of records being stolen, it's obviously coming from a server of some sort. So that's where we're going to focus our attention today. We're going to talk about external threats, and we'll talk about internal threats after that. When I talk about external threats, I talk about it from a web application perspective, from an HTTP, HTTPS perspective. That's just where my expertise lies. There are a lot of different ways where how you can have external threats coming in, FTP, email, DNS, and other sorts of fun things, etc. The reality is when we're talking about external threats from a data perspective, the element within an organization that has the direct access to your data resources is typically your web application. It's also a big server that happens to have a lot of external access directly through your network firewalls, your next generation firewalls, even your application aware firewalls have to allow HTTP, they have to allow HTTPS. Some of them can decrypt HTTPS, most of them don't, even if they can. The reality is there's this open channel that exists to your web applications, and there's a lovely open channel from your web applications to your SharePoint, your file server, your databases, and all the stuff we want to try to keep secret, but we have a very difficult time doing it. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to build this slide out here. There we go. So when we look at the external threat, there's a lot of different threats that certainly exist. Industrialized hacking, we'll talk a little bit about the industrialization of hacking. I have a slide on in a minute. Targeted criminal hacking. Effectively, it's a criminal saying, this is the company, or this is the department, or this is the information that I need to steal. And they target a very specific source. It's a little bit less common, and this is what the charts down below are all about. You can see in the chart on the left, you can see APT. I'm not going to talk that much about APT today, and primarily because you've probably all already been talked about APT. But the reality is APT certainly does exist. It certainly is very sophisticated. That's the whole concept behind it. But if you look at the chart to the right, you can also see that the likelihood of APT compared to targeted criminal hacking or industrialization of hacking, which is just essentially automated hacking, is far less likely. So where do you try to put your security resources? Where do your security resources need to focus? Well, I say start with the low-hanging fruit. If you don't have protection on the industrialization of hacking, what I mean is, again, automated attacks, very simple attacks, though very effective attacks. If you don't have security there, start there. Targeted criminal hacks. If you don't have protection there from somebody focused targeting on your application, then focus there. Lastly, then focus on your APT. A lot of times the first two will help you with your APT, but the reality is, and I think in my conversations with a lot of law enforcement, if somebody really wants to get into your environment, there's a high likelihood they're going to. The idea is you need to be able to see them doing it so that you can ultimately stop them and prevent them. We'll talk about some mitigation strategies for that. With web applications, I like to pick on third-party apps. And what I mean by third-party apps are things like WordPress and Drupal and Joomla and vBulletin and all these kinds of apps. And if you're not an application developer, you might say, I don't know what any of those are. I don't even know if I use them.
there's a high likelihood that you actually do use one of these applications, because they're actually used in a significant number of applications that are developed today. Well over 70% of applications that are in service, if you will, across the internet are using some part of third-party app. It's really a bit of a problem. Let's dig a little bit into it. So again, as I said, up to 70% of internally developed code. This is code that your teams or your consultants or whoever it is developed their code. Over 70% of that code is actually developed outside that team. They may buy the app and plug it into your application. That now means that you need to patch that app whenever a patch comes out. It means that you need to monitor that app for any vulnerabilities that that app happens to have. And most applications don't have one third-party app. They may have hundreds of third-party apps. And in some cases, you buy a third-party app, and it may itself have third-party apps part of it that you're hoping that customer keeps up to date. I'm not saying don't patch your applications, and I'm not saying don't do secure coding. I'm just suggesting that it's a very complex problem to try and solve. OWASP. I won't ask for a show of hands in a room this large, but normally I would ask, anybody familiar with OWASP? So I suspect a lot of you are familiar with OWASP, but at the end of the day, they try to give you some bit of understanding of what are the things that you should be trying to protect on your web applications themselves. They give you their top 10 or their top 100 sometimes. But generally their top 10, and one of their top 10 has this bottom paragraph. Applications using components with known vulnerabilities may undermine application defenses and enable a large range of possible attacks. Without a doubt, I assure you, and I'll give you some great examples of this here in a minute. This is certainly a good example of this. SSL, OpenSSL is a third-party application. Lots of people do use it, and lots of people obviously were hit with this. I'm not going to go into details of the Heartbleed issue, but the reality is it was an issue. Everybody had to go and patch it. Hopefully you're patched and past that, or you had to have some mitigating solution to prevent access to it. One of the other challenges here, we're talking about third-party apps, but what about legacy applications, right? How many of you have had the issue where you've got an application, you have nobody to fix the application, you have no intention of fixing the application, yet you're forced to use the application because it solves some solution within the department or within the organization. Right? This is a common issue, right? We work with a lot of financial institutions that make a lot of acquisitions every quarter, every year. When they make an acquisition, one of the first things that they do, they look at the application infrastructure for that organization that they've acquired. When they look at that infrastructure, they say, all right, what apps are we going to keep and what apps are we going to get rid of? And it takes them anywhere from 6 months to a year to transition all of the information from one application that they want to get rid of over to the applications that the core main acquiring company or acquiring financial institution wants these users to actually use. The problem with this is for that year, nobody's patching those applications. They're legacy applications. Nobody's looking at them, but there's still tons of private data on there. This is another reason why people start to look at web application security and how do you protect those applications that you don't care about either. We understand we need to protect the ones that we do care about, but what about the ones you want to get rid of? Do you just leave them to the side and accept the risk, or do you have to do something about it? So again, third-party apps and legacy apps. WordPress plugins, a couple of examples here. So 20 million downloads is the WordPress vulnerability download. It's a problem. I mean, when you start to think about all the organizations that use WordPress, and again, if you're not familiar with WordPress, just assume that you use it. There's a high likelihood that you do, or you use something similar to it. And you may have vulnerabilities in it if you haven't patched them. If you've got 300, 400 applications and 70% of them use some sort of third-party code, you're patching a lot. Or not patching if you're like most organizations that I talk to, unfortunately. Another example here, right? I'm not going to read the examples, but thousands of websites hacked via a vBulletin hole. Within 30 minutes of a vulnerability being truly identified and going public, there were over 30,000 websites that were hacked with the vBulletin vulnerability. Right? 30,000 within 30 minutes. It's a very, very fast hack. It's a very, very easy hack. And let me give you some examples why. So when we look at what it normally takes to hit a website, if I'm going to attack your website and I'm not going to use automation, it means I have to go to your website, I've got to find a vulnerability on your website, I've got to exploit the vulnerability, there's work that I have to do, it's custom work that has to be done, and then I move on to the next one, and then I move on to the next one, and I move on to the next one. It's very time consuming, it's not really very efficient, to be honest. When I look at a vulnerability in an application, if I can just find your application, find out what you're using, I can simply target the application, and this is the difference between targeted criminal hacking and the industrialization of hacking. Right, so this is industrializing it. What this means is, you might say, why would anybody ever attack me? Why would anybody care? My data just isn't that important. It's addresses and usernames or who knows what, right? It's just not that important. The reality is when we're talking about these third-party components, I'm not really being selective. I'm just going out to Google and I'm going to do a Google dork, right? If you're not familiar with Google dork, it's essentially searching Google for information that would help me target what types of applications you might be using or specific information that I might be wanting. When I find out that you're using, for example, WordPress on your application, I may find out that you're using it, I may find out that another 50,000 people are using it. I'm just going to plug it into a script, and I'm just going to run the exploit because you all have the same WordPress version, the same WordPress patch, and I'm picking on WordPress here, okay, but it can be any third-party app. If I find the third-party app and I find the vulnerability that's there, I'm going to simply go out to all of them and hit all of them. And then I've got a nice list of all the vulnerable websites that I've now got access to and I know are vulnerable to it. I can then pick and choose which ones are most appropriate to me based on the information that I want to get, or I just go steal all the information that I can from those websites and I weed through the information to decide what's important to me. I can decide which way I want to do it in the first place. All right, so the point is third-party applications are certainly a critical pain point for organizations, and they're almost never patched in any reasonable amount of time. So again, back to the Heartbleed piece, kind of a corollary here is the change cipher spec. I'm not going to talk about the details on it, but the little graphic there kind of spells it out. The reality is even when you went and patched the spec itself, you didn't actually fix all the vulnerabilities, you actually increased the vulnerabilities by 28 more vulnerabilities. All right, so a lot of times the patch introduces other problems as well. And I'm not saying that happens all the time, but obviously as a security practice, as an application practice, you've got to be aware and be on top of these sort of things. It's not enough just to patch it, you've got to go back and stay on top of those patches to make sure that there's not a secondary patch that identifies the vulnerabilities that maybe they just exposed by solving one problem or another. Now, this is White Hat Security's annual review of applications that they've done white hat penetration testing on. I like to use it because it helps me by industry identify where people are doing a good job, where people maybe aren't doing such a good job. If I look at it overall, over all the organizations, whether it's civilian, whether it's government, whether it's whatever, departments, organizations, what have you, 86% of websites have vulnerabilities. I'm actually surprised that there's 16% of applications that don't, to be honest. But 86% of applications have vulnerabilities. That's a pretty big deal. Average vulnerabilities, 56 vulnerabilities per application, and it takes on average 193 days to actually mitigate each individual vulnerability itself. And many of these vulnerabilities, I know many of you have run application scanners before, many of these vulnerabilities aren't mitigatable. You can't fix them. You can change the application, you can upgrade the application, you can do things, but you might not be able to fix the vulnerability itself. Now, and I hate to throw anybody under the bus here, and it's probably not any of your organizations in the room, I'm sure, but the worst one is education. 100% of that White Hat tested, 100% of them that were tested had vulnerabilities, and it took them on average almost a year to fix the vulnerabilities that White Hat would ultimately go and scan. Now, obviously, White Hat doesn't have every educational organization in the world, right? So, as I said, many of you probably aren't in this particular statistic. But the reality is education is notoriously complicated to try and solve this problem because you have a particular page for a particular professor, for a particular department, for a particular subject. It's thousands upon thousands of pages that organizations, departments within the school itself can run their own web applications themselves and control their own web application. I won't say it's impossible, but trying to patch all of that and trying to keep it under control is a very, very, very difficult task. And we'll talk about how we can help mitigate that in a little while. So when I think about industrialization of hacking, I like to just simply bring up a bit of what it takes to be a software organization. And this is actually a kind of a direct corollary to what it takes to be a software organization that creates hacking tools. And so what we found is when we look at hacking tools, we identified that they operate exactly like a software organization. They've got research vulnerabilities, they develop exploits, they grow bots, etc. I'm going to show you a graphic on that in a minute. They do all the work, including support. If you have a problem with your hacking tool, you can contact support. Usually it's through a back channel, but they'll help you out. They'll make sure your tools actually work. Now, there are open source tools and other things that they don't really support this that well, but there are, when you pay $500 or $1,000 for a particular tool that you wanted to use, Zeus or any sort of spyware or whatever, then you're going to be able to get some level of support. The point is, these are organizations, they're out to make money, and they're out to make money at all levels of this. They'll sell you the tool, they'll use the data, they'll buy the data, they'll create a black market for the data itself. All of this certainly exists, and it looks a little bit like this. So we start, and these organizations have an 8 to 5 job, so you have your vulnerability and exploit developer. In many countries, you have people that literally have an 8 to 5 job. They come in every day, and their job is to find 0 days. That's all they do, find 0 days. Once they find a 0 day, they bring it over to another department. That department is the botnet grower. Their job is to go out there and find those vulnerabilities. If it's an application, they don't care what application it is. They don't care what customer it is. They want your server so that your server can be part of the botnet. We don't see endpoints that much being part of a botnet anymore. We see servers being part of the botnets. The botnets are getting massive, and you'll see me talk a little bit about this in the DDoS section when I get to it. But once they have the botnet, then they can move over and they can offer the botnet for lease. Right? So you can lease the botnet for whatever time you need. Right? I've got one customer that said, look, I obviously work in a software company and we're driven by sales. So I had a particular customer come to me and they said, look, I know I can buy your product next year, but if you do something, if I have problems this year, I'll go ahead and pull the trigger on this and make it happen a little bit sooner. And it's not one customer. I have this happen all the time. Right? We'll move faster if we have an incident, but if we don't have an incident, then I'll move it at a certain specific pace. The reality is it's real easy to have an incident. Anybody who wants to can go and lease a application and cause an incident. It's very, very simple to do. And this is what this leasing is all about. You can lease people to hack. You can lease people to DDoS. DDoS is very cheap. It's about $25 for a couple of hours of DDoS. You can get several gigs of DDoS. You can do even more. It's very, very simple. Sometimes you have to speak Russian to do it, but not always. So then they take it to the extortionists, right? The extortionists are the ones that are ultimately going to lease the tool itself. So just a note here from Gartner, and again, I'm not one to read slides necessarily, but I will read this one. Firewalls and intrusion prevention systems don't provide sufficient protections for most public-facing websites or internal business critical and custom web applications. I've worked for firewall companies before. I can tell you, you need them. You've got to have a network firewall. There's no doubt about it. I'm not suggesting that you don't. There's just always been a bit of ambiguity, right? I've been doing this for 12 years, and I still talk to customers today, and they say, I don't need to protect my web applications because I have a next-generation firewall, and it's called an application firewall. I'm protected. I'm good. So Gartner wanted to be very clear about this. So when I build this slide out here, it says WAFs are different from next-generation firewalls and IPSs. WAFs protect at a granular level the enterprise's custom web applications against web attacks. They helped us spell it out because they recognized that there was this ambiguity, that the network security solutions are designed to solve network security problems. Now, you may say, well, they are application firewalls. It's perfectly true and it's perfectly legitimate. They will understand that email is email and FTP is FTP, and you may or may not have to create a policy for it. It may just do it based on port or traffic. But the reality is they really know nothing about your applications. It's not their fault. That's not their focus. A web application firewall is really what you want to try and focus on when we're talking about these external threats. And that's why I end with this slide. So let's move on to DDoS. DDoS oftentimes is talked about in conjunction with web application firewalls, as it should be. But at the end of the day, traditional DDoS has always been this network attack, right? Ping of death, SYN flood, all these sorts of fun things. Just some statistics. So we have a cloud DDoS solution as well as an on-premise DDoS solution. But this is where we get our statistics, right? So over the last 12 months, what we've seen is DDoS traffic itself, the actual traffic coming in from DDoS bots has increased over 240%. We see it over and over and over again. What we see on a weekly basis, 12 million different DDoS bots hitting our infrastructure, our cloud infrastructure, and this is where we get these statistics because we have the cloud infrastructure, we can see it. So we're seeing the DDoS spike significantly, and it looks a lot like this up here at the top. Right, so in 2013, if you can't read it, 2013, the height that we would see in terms of regular, every week DDoS was about 4 gigs. It wasn't really a lot. Certainly we can handle it. Many organizations don't have a 4 gig pipe, but your ISP may, and they may be able to mitigate it for you. What we're seeing now on a weekly basis exceeds 40 gig. The biggest DDoS we've seen personally in our own infrastructure at this point has been 900 gig. 900 gig is a massive, massive DDoS for anybody. And we're able to mitigate it, but it's taxing, right? Our max is about 1.5 terabytes. So they consumed almost, or a bit more than half of our overall capacity. If you look at the bottom, you can see the percentages here. I won't read them to you. But the percentages, the majority of it is less than 20 gigs, but we're seeing a massive increase in terms of the 30 gig, 40 gig, and then we have that every once in a while, the massive attack that's a pointed, focused attack. So what do we see from this, and what do we really mean by this? Well, when you think about DDoS, and the reason I say DDoS really has to be looked at as a new avenue in terms of how you're going to secure and protect against DDoS. One of the things you have to understand is that DDoS is a challenge, and it's a big challenge because it's not just being able to recognize that I've got a bunch of packets coming in from a bunch of IP addresses that don't belong there. There are a lot of vectors when we start to talk about DDoS that are very, very complex. For example, when somebody hits your web application, it's HTTP, it's HTTPS. If I hit your application and I do, let's say I access your search page, and I want to hit your search page, and it's the Food Network. We like to use this example at Imperva. It's the Food Network. And I want to search on Brussels sprouts, and I want to search on chicken. I think you can all guess I'm going to get more recipes for chicken than I am for Brussels sprouts. So if I do a search on chicken over and over and over again, there's a high likelihood I'm going to flood your web application, but even in the event I don't, hopefully I can cause your database to turn over and start serving server 500 errors. I'm happy with either one, but I'll take both. The challenge is the vectors. It's all HTTP, so how do I get out the bad HTTP and keep the good HTTP or HTTPS in? Well, we have mechanisms that allow us to do that. We can inject different things into it, cookies and JavaScript and CAPTCHA and all kinds of things to make sure there's a human out there. How many, I don't want to ask a question, too many people. When you look at CAPTCHA, if you're familiar with CAPTCHA, right, that thing that you can never read and you have to do it over and over again. When you get a CAPTCHA piece and you start to type it in, obviously we're trying to identify that you are in fact truly a human. You're really a human that's out there, you're not a bot. We've actually found bots now, we've seen it twice, we've found bots that can solve CAPTCHA. So we're trying to identify bots versus humans because we find that over 51% of the traffic that hits your website, and I say yours because, again, in the cloud we've got over, I think at this point, 10,000 customers in the cloud. And in that scenario, we're finding that 51% of the traffic that hit those websites is all bot traffic. Over 30% of that traffic is bad bot traffic that you simply don't want. So our goal is to get rid of that bad bot traffic. Because it's going to be a bot. I assure you, it will be a bot. If you're having DDoS, it's going to be a bot. It's not somebody sitting there pressing the enter button over and over and over and over and over again. That's not going to take you down, right? It's a bot. So we have to identify those bots for what they are. And the more complex that bot is, the more difficult it is. It truly is a cat and mouse game. And each method that an attacker uses is considered a different vector. Volumetric vectors, protocol vectors, and different types of HTTP vectors. It's not enough just to protect it at the network. If you're protecting just at the network, just at the IP layer, layer 3, you're not going to be able to protect your DDoSes these days. You simply won't be able to. So again, I talked a second ago about how do you mitigate, how do you identify these bots? And if you look at the chart on the right, which is the one I really care about here, bots are getting smarter, right? So primitive bots, these are the ones that are very easy. I can inject a simple cookie into them and they don't know anything about a cookie, so I know that they're not really a browser. I can get rid of them very simply. I have others that can accept the cookie and they'll treat the cookie as they would a real browser. Well, that's more difficult. So now I'm going to inject maybe some JavaScript inside there. Can they handle scripting? Well, maybe they can't, and then they fall out. Then you have that little blue sliver there. Those are the ones that can even accept JavaScript. And we then have the next method, which is CAPTCHA, and we'll add more method, and another method, and another method. It's a very manual process, to be honest, to be able to protect against DDoS these days because, as I said, it truly is a cat and mouse game. And we've seen now 5 vector attacks where somebody starts with IP, somebody goes to SynFlood, somebody goes to a headless browser that handles cookies, somebody moves on to a push-do tool that allows us to handle JavaScript, and then finally they move over to a Firefox plugin that handles CAPTCHA. Right, and constantly we're tweaking our policy to make sure that we're able to mitigate them, but it's truly a difficult process, but it can be done. So what do you do about this, right? So what we find organizations doing about DDoS, right? You've got to have the scale. You've got to have the bandwidth. If you don't have the bandwidth, you're done anyway, right? So we're finding more and more organizations moving away from on-premise solutions for anti-DDoS and moving toward the cloud for anti-DDoS, where you truly do have the scale, the bandwidth, having that multiple tens to hundreds of gigabytes of space that you have. Understanding that you need to have 24/7 service. You need to have something that's going to be able to handle not just in the daytime when you're there, but also at nighttime, and also handle any protocol. It can't just be DDoS on ping of death. It can't just be a certain ICMP type attack. It's got to be something that can monitor all the different protocols that are necessary. And we're also recognizing you need real-time visibility, as I said. And lastly, you need to be able to change rapidly. You have to be able to fix this problem rapidly because I assure you, they change. The attackers can change very, very quickly and start the DDoS over again in a completely different manner. Today, I'm not aware of an automated solution that doesn't require some level of manual interaction to be able to handle some type of a 4, 5, even a 6-vector DDoS attack. You have to have somebody who's has a level of expertise to understand what's happening in the traffic now and be able to change something on the policy to mitigate it. All right, let's move over to insider threats. That's external threats, obviously, going through the web application. Let's talk about insider threats and what I mean by insider threats. Well, let's take a look at it here real quick. I'm going to spend a little bit less time on this one than I've done the other one. On the other one, we talked about APT, looking at the charts on the bottom right. We talked about APT. We talked about the targeted criminal hacking. We talked about insider industrialization of hacking. But we talked about insider threats. Insider threats can be compromised insiders, which I know you're all familiar with, malware, right? A compromised insider, whether it's through phishing or a drive-by download, who knows what it is, but some type of compromised insider, or the malicious insider, which again you're all, I'm sure, familiar with, Edward Snowden and all those kind of folks. But anyway, the bad guy. The reality is, in the Verizon breach report that was in 2012, they actually noted that malicious hackers are on the decline. We're not seeing as many malicious hackers. They still exist for sure, But we're not seeing as many malicious hackers today as we did in the past. Instead, it's far easier for people to get the data that they want through compromising insiders. It's just easier. Why would they try to find some sort of a spy or some sort of a malicious person to steal the data when they can just steal the data themselves? It's just that much easier. So insider threats don't have to be that sophisticated. It's just stealing credentials and then accessing data. But the incidents, how often it happens, malware, I would guess that if I were to ask who's had malware in here, I'd get a whole room full of hands. It's everywhere, right? It happens everywhere. And we'll talk a little bit about mitigating it. But how easy is it to get malware? Well, I'm on LinkedIn. It's easy, right? If I want to target malware, I go to LinkedIn. I can say, give me the DBAs at Bank of America. I pick on Bank of America just because it's my bank, not because they're a customer or anything like that, but they're my bank. So I say, who are the DBAs at Bank of America? Well, when I dig into it, I can look at it. I don't know if I blow that one up. I don't. So I can see the DBAs. Now, I've obfuscated their names here, obviously, but I can target the source that I want to. And I can send these folks a phishing email, give them a call, whatever. Social engineering and other things are not that complicated. I can get them infected. The reality is you're going to have people that are infected. You can try to educate. You can try to educate as much as you want to. I was talking with a department here, and they said they had over 100,000 employees. 100,000 employees, you're not going to keep all of them from clicking that button, right? Somebody's going to click that link, right? So what do you do about it? What happens then? And I know there's certainly solutions that are out there. So I break down these solutions here. This is from Sept, and they identify the stages, if you will, of insider threat or exfiltration. I'm just going to build this out. And the reason I put this up here is to talk a little bit about what really is controllable and what's not controllable. If we look at the top, exploration. This is where you try to prevent malware. Try to prevent somebody from becoming that insider threat in the first place. And you can do that. There are a lot of low-hanging fruit where you can try to prevent that malware. The reality is it only takes one person to get infected for your data to get stolen. It only takes one. And it takes a very simple piece of code. If somebody wants to target your organization, if I wanted to target your organization, I would write a completely custom piece of malware. I wouldn't use something off the shelf. It would be completely custom. It would have a high likelihood of being able to bypass the solutions that you have today if they're looking for malware. So the point is that at the top, I put this as red. I'm not saying you don't need anti-malware, just like I don't say that you don't need antivirus. You do. They have their place. They can catch a lot of the low-hanging fruit. But if you're really trying to prevent access to your data and making sure about it, there are other things that you can do and other places in this chart that you can do it. At the bottom, obviously, the bottom two, it's a bit late at that point. So, what's the point? They're already executing the exploit and they're already doing the exfiltration and trying to cover their tracks. It's nice. It's great if you can see them there, but we would hope that you would have seen them before then. Where you can really do the most effective work when it comes to identifying insider threats, not specifically malware, but insider threats, is being able to monitor your servers themselves and actually understand how people interact with your servers. Because one thing that all insider threat incidents have in common is they have to get credentials. In some cases, they may already have them. In other cases, they may have to steal them or pull them off of some other system. Once they get those credentials, they start pulling information from the servers, whatever those servers happen to be. When they pull those servers, 9 times out of 10, that traffic does not look like the traffic as it normally does. They're accessing data they don't normally access. They're accessing it at wrong times and wrong volumes. And it's a place where you can really identify what happens there. So point is in the two areas that we talk about there, experimentation and exploitation, that's a great opportunity because they are experimenting. They are working toward an exploit. And to do all that, the traffic does not normally look normal. But anyway, it does look abnormal, I should say. But the reality is this is where you can really be able to identify that data. So I'm going to open up just a couple of these here. Changes to, challenge to custom malware, the attack threat of attackers. Certainly Home Depot's aware of it, right? We don't have all the information from Home Depot yet, but more and more is coming out. But again, this isn't even on a database, right? This is on point of sale. The point is still being able to access through insider threat. It's a beautiful target to hit if you can, and you can get into an organization. When we talk about insider threat and APT, this is my one slide on APT. Certainly, when we talk about insider threats, this type of attack is not your pointed web application attack. It's the types of attacks that can really sit there for a long time. This is back to my point. If I were going to create malware, I would be creating malware that's completely custom. And that kind of malware can oftentimes sit out there for days, if not years. So when we look at I like the Verizon Data Breach Report, but this is 2011. This one's a bit older, but it talks about web application servers and database servers. And they talk about two things. They talk about in large organizations and in all organizations, the percentage of records that are stolen, right? So in large organizations, 33% of the time, it's web applications and database servers that are accessed, and 82% of the records for web servers and 98% of the data that comes out of databases, that's where your exfiltration occurs. And if you compare that, you can look at all the other red numbers in that list over there. The next closest highest number is 36%, and that's from desktops and workstations. right? And if I look at my organizations and I look at people that I talk to, I say, you spend so much money on antivirus, and it's great that you have antivirus, but you don't have anything looking at your databases. You don't have anything looking at your applications, and the statistics are pretty clear that that's where your data is being stolen. It's not coming from your endpoints. So I do read this one to you. It's super small, so I suggest maybe you just listen to me reading it, which is why I read it. So I'm just going to read the bottom part. I had one such discussion with a security practitioner last week. There were 3 specific capabilities with the database that he wanted. User identities in the audit trail. I just want to know who the user is that's touching my data. Segregation of administrative roles, and data encryption. I just want to do 3 things with the data in my database. The DBA said they could not provide, respectively. The reasons were, it can't be done, the database doesn't support that, and it's a performance problem. Okay? As I say, the problem is that none of these statements are true. In fact, they're all relatively easy to do. Now, I would argue that data encryption would not be classified as easy to do, but the fact is it can be done. When we look at this type of argument, this is exactly what I try to talk to my customers about all the time. Security and databases, or security and data, is oftentimes like oil and water. They just don't mix that well. I find security people all the time that are great at the security organization, but when I ask them, what do you do when somebody steals data from your database? What have you done? And they say, well, I go to my DBAs and ask them for the logs and hope that they were doing logging. It's kind of one of these areas where they kind of hope that something's being done, but there's not often a strategy around being able to protect that data. And if I use the word SharePoint, right, people say, I'm not even going to open the can of worms. I don't know who accesses it, how they access it, or what data is in it. I know there's sensitive data there. I can't audit it. I can't look at it. And again, it's a can of worms I just don't want to open. Right? But there are solutions that are certainly out there to be able to audit and look at all that information and give you real-time alerting. But it's oftentimes from a security department, organization perceived as a complex solution. So this is Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. It's a third-party organization. It's a great search engine if you're interested in understanding what type of data has been stolen, how it's been stolen, et cetera. I go through it, and I look at it every once in a while, maybe every 6 months or so, and just see if there's anybody new in here. The value of this really speaks to how much organizations audit or monitor their data. And this is one I brought up, and I didn't validate whether any of you are on this list or not, so I apologize if you're on the list. This is simply public knowledge. But the reality here is they all have one thing in common, and that is the number of records that were breached is unknown. The number of records that breach is critical. Now, I don't know in the government space if it's as critical as, say, the financial sector, or more commonly the e-commerce sector, where when you have, for example, 4 million credit cards that are stolen, then you have to start paying some money back, right? You've got to send out letters, you've got to do credit monitoring, all this kind of stuff, right? South Carolina certainly learned their lesson on that one. The reality here is when we look at this type of data, they could have understood how many records it was that was actually taken. A good example here is Zappos. Anybody, again, I can't ask questions. So too many people in the room. So my wife shops at Zappos all the time, and I'd argue I've probably bought a pair of shoes off of Zappos as well, some running shoes. Point is they have a lot of data that's out there, and they were breached. They had data stolen. They had 4 million records stolen. They don't really know they had 4 million records stolen. The FTC, back to my point on one of the early slides, they didn't know that they were even breached until the FTC came to them and said, hey, you guys were breached. What was taken? And they said, we really don't know. Well, what table was hit? Well, all this data is in this particular table. How many records are in that table? 4 million records. Then if you can't tell us it was 5 records or 10 records or 100 records, it's 4 million records. So you want to understand what type of data you have and who's accessing that data. Even if you're auditing it just in case you get breached, you're not trying to do it proactively. I encourage you to use audit as a proactive tool, but even if you're using it as a reactive tool, understanding what was actually breached is critical when you're starting to do forensics and understand how to prevent it the next time. And these organizations obviously didn't have that data. So why do we need to audit? Well, we need to audit for a lot of reasons, and it's important to a lot of people. Audit is not just a DBA problem. Audit is a problem for security. It's a problem for risk. It's a problem for usually many different departments within an organization, regardless of whether they're DBA, security, or risk. You know, the point here is you've got to be able to have organizations that all work together, and this is a critical piece. Some of our best customers utilize our product, and they work with their risk team, their security team, and their DBA team, and they all come together to have similar reporting, and they work as a team on the data. At the end of the day, everything that you're doing from a security perspective, in most cases, is about protecting your data. Yes, it might be about BYOD, it might be about network security, it might be about email security, but at the end of the day, you're not really concerned if somebody blows out a router. I mean, yeah, that'd be a problem, but it's not as bad as losing 50 million records. Right? It's the data that we're trying to protect. So why don't we audit? Well, we don't audit for all these reasons up here. And if any of you have ever talked to the DBAs, and I'm not proposing DBAs are bad folks. They have their own agenda, right? They've got to get this database up. They've got to keep it up. They've got to have high performance. So they have their own things that they have to go on. But we don't audit because it does have a database impact sometimes. Right? If you use certain products that won't have the impact, other products certainly will, and we'll talk about that. Data audit storage impact, right? I'm not going to read all these to you, but the point is there are a lot of them, right? So, time-consuming, difficult to use, don't know what to audit, where sensitive data actually is located. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to a customer and asked them, let's start off, before we do audit, just tell me where your sensitive data is. And their answer is I think I know where it is, and then we can scan their network and we find that there's 20% more data than they actually thought was there. And the DBA team is usually small and usually busy. So what do we do about auditing? What are the solutions that we actually have? Well, you can utilize the built-in native auditing that's in the database. This is what we've been doing for the last 30 years. It's what a lot of organizations still do today. It does, in fact, have a massive impact on your database, and I have lots of customers that still do that today. That tends to be part of the problem. You have certainly the ability to use a third-party solution. The third-party solution is obviously what we would recommend, and it's what we're finding is certainly effective because it doesn't affect your database. It does give you the visibility, and it works with the security team, giving you the separation of duty, so the security team can understand what they're seeing from a database perspective, even though they might not understand database. And then, of course, we have what a whole lot of customers do, which is do not audit. Right? That's certainly a solution. It's certainly an opportunity for people to change a bit about what they do, but do not audit is not necessarily what I would recommend, obviously, but it is a significant solution that I see implemented, if you will, in the industry, and I would encourage people to change that where they can. So let's talk about the recommendations. I've got about 3 more slides. So I put this slide up. We've already read it. I'm not going to read it again. I just like to reiterate it. When we're talking about external threats, we're talking about what do you do about external threats? A lot of organizations have the network infrastructure there to prevent the network style threats themselves, but what do you do about those external threats that are accessing your external identity, your web applications, the access to your data? Right? Even Gartner says, look, unless you have some specific solution to solve the problem, and they call it directly out, unless you have a web application firewall in front of your web applications, the security solutions that you have today are not going to be able to cut it. And if I do talk to customers that say, well, I developed secure code, we have a secure coding practice, and you absolutely should have a secure coding practice. Again, you're not going to be able to patch all your applications. You won't be able to patch all the third-party applications, and I assure you, you have legacy applications that don't get patched anyway. So web application firewalls are, in my opinion, here to stay. As I said, I've been doing it for 12 years. It's a big piece of what we do for external threats. DDoS. So what do you do about DDoS, right? Takeaways, you have to move the point of mitigation closer to the attacker. You've got to get it away from your servers and closer to your attacker. This is why we're seeing more and more people move from the on-premise solutions, your Arbors and even our on-premise solution. We see people not trying to prevent DDoS with the on-premise solution. Instead of trying to do DDoS, instead they're doing DDoS in the cloud where you have this scale. That's where you're going to have the capacity to be able to handle a 1 terabit or plus DDoS. We haven't seen 1 terabit plus yet, but as I said, we expect it in the next year. SaaS, or infrastructure as a service. Maybe it's Amazon Web Services. Maybe it's a cloud web application firewall, what have you. DDoS is advanced and persistent. I've talked about those vectors, all these different vectors and ways that you have to manually prevent DDoS. Well, you have to have the volume. You have to have the capacity that's certainly there. You have to have something that's going to be able to adapt to that attack as it occurs. And more importantly, you've got to have rapid analysis tools, instant remediation infrastructure, and the key thing here is you've got to have experts at the wheel. You have to have somebody that knows how to mitigate it. It's not as simple as creating a firewall rule to mitigate DDoS. It's far simpler, quite frankly, to mitigate SQL injection or cross-site scripting or other types of attacks than it is to mitigate DDoS, because DDoS is real-time, it's fast, and it changes very, very frequently. And if you don't have the expertise in DDoS, it becomes a very, very big challenge to solve that problem. Quite frankly, from our business, we tend to get the majority of our business from DDoSes that are actively happening where somebody's tried to solve the problem, they can't do it, and they want to get back up, and they call us and we get them back up. And it's very simple to do. But it's a very reactive approach to doing DDoS, perfectly fine, but that tends to be where we get the majority of our business, where people are doing it reactive. Typically, once they've done it reactive, they never turn it off again. They leave on the solution, so they're proactive, they're on. But that's what we happen to see. We actually just mitigated one on a hoster that hosts banking websites in Norway. Big anonymous attack that happened. Mitigated it in 30 minutes, but they'd been trying for well over 3 days to try and mitigate it. Obviously for us it was very quick, it was very easy, and we solved the problem. So we have an analogy, right? We talked earlier that we're going to talk about servers, we weren't going to talk about end users. Well, we don't talk about end users for a very specific reason. From our perspective, if you have an infested house of all these mice, you've got mice all over the house, and you've got one block of cheese, and that's your data. It's far easier to just put a lid, put some protection around the cheese itself, put protection around the data. Forget about the mice. Don't worry about them. You're going to have mice, I assure you. At some point, you're going to have something in your network. We're talking about an insider threat. We're talking about you will have an insider that's in there that is compromised. Don't worry about it. You're going to have it. It's going to happen. Instead, put some protection around the servers themselves, around the data itself. Even if you're just auditing it, just looking at it, don't choose to go the route of not auditing. Auditing solutions are out there. They exist. Please use them. So why do we have this problem? Well, we have the problem because in 2001, the security matched the threat. It happened in 2001. It was very simple, right? We had pretty good security. The threat has significantly changed over the last 14 years, 13 years. The threats have changed significantly. And we're finding that the security implementations themselves, what we put in and what we see when we go and talk to our customers, hasn't really changed very much. Kind of the same stuff. New versions of it, right? New network firewalls, new intrusion prevention systems, new emails, et cetera. But the threats are very, very different. They found the hole. And there's a common saying, right? Attackers are like water, right? They're going to take the path of least resistance. That's what they're doing right now. They're taking the path of least resistance. They're not going up against your network firewalls and your IDSs and IPSs. When was the last time you saw cmd.exe tried in an IDS? Right? What's the point, right? Everybody knows that you've got protection on it. They'll try something different. So I put this up here. All public knowledge, all easily on the internet. And the reason I put it up here is these are all targets, successful data breaches, successful data theft. I've got a much longer list, obviously. There's many more customers than this. I just update it every once in a while as there's a new key one. That's why Home Depot's up at the top. The reality is they all have firewalls. They all have antivirus. They all have IDS, IPS. They all have email security. Many of them don't have database audit. They don't have insider threat protection. They don't have external threat protection on their web applications, and their data gets stolen. Right, it's back to 98% of the data that gets stolen comes from databases. Well, I forget what the other statistic was, but let's call it 70% of the data comes from your web applications, right? It's a significant portion, and this is what we're seeing getting stolen out there. Thank you. Thank you.